Okay, so I will simply start from my right, and we will do this collective rounds of questioning and challenging, I hope. So I will start with Professor Rothstein, our beloved coordinator of the Anti-Corp project.
Thank you. Do you hear me? Yeah. Thank you, Alina. Thanks for inviting me. Congratulations to the center here. It's exactly what we need, this type of research initiative. Yes, I'm from the Quality of Government Institute, University of Gothenburg, and when I presented Anti-Corp and the Quality of Government Institute at Stanford this spring, one of the PhD students came up after the talk and she said, I don't get it. Swedes who are studying corruption, it seems like a bunch of nuns running a strip club. I mean, this is... but it's nice to have a sort of look from the outside of these issues, I think. I think it's important to remember a number of things here. Every time you give a talk about these issues, you immediately, both from academic colleagues and from policy people and the public, you get the question, how do you fix it? How do you erase corruption? And I have two answers to this question. One is, yes, the one who breaks this problem is likely to get the Nobel Prize in economics. So this is the magnitude of the problem here. Secondly, it's important to remember that this is a fairly young research enterprise. It basically started in the late 1990s. Very few people have been engaged in this type of research. I and my generation of Scandinavian political scientists, sociologists, economists, went through their undergraduate education and their PhD program, and I've spoken with lots of colleagues without this issue ever being on the agenda. It was never talked about. If you go through the textbooks, so in economics and political science, even in public administration from this time, and you look for words about corruption or good governance, you will find nothing. So my first answer to this question sort of is, if I'm correctly informed, we have been going on for like 10, 15 years at the most. The criminologists have been working for, what is it, 60 years? They have really not solved the problem of crime, have they? The economists have been going on for 150 years, and they have really not solved the problem of economic crisis, if I'm correctly informed. So this is a very early question, you know. Can you fix the problem? And of course, the first thing people will say to fix the problem, I can fix the problem tomorrow. It's just to say you have to have an honest civil service, you have to have honest judiciary, you have to have honest politicians, then it will be fixed. Well, that is basically what people in the policy business say. But that is just repeating the data. If you have an honest civil service, if you have an honest judiciary, you don't have corruption. So it's just repeating the data. So we have to step several steps back. I'm now digging in things like mass education from the 1870s and correlating that with today's levels of corruption. And you find strong correlation. So that is creating the right distance between the independent and dependent variables is very important. I forgot all the questions here.
No, you're supposed to answer only to the first, okay?
Okay.
So
I have answered the first. It's too early to start writing out recipes. We are researchers. We have to be a little patient. I think, if I should give a personal statement here, I think that the problem, it's very true that we have had an enormous increased attention to issues of good governance and anti-corruption, but although you can forever discuss the validity and reliability of the measures, I basically believe that what you say is right. There has been very little improvement on the ground globally. There are some improvements, but we don't really know why they work. It may be for two reasons. One is that the problem have conceptually been ill-defined. We really don't know what it is. So if you take the standard definition of corruption, misuse or abuse of public power for private gain, that's in my word a useless definition because abuse or is not defined, so you don't know what is it. That means that what is corruption in Denmark will be completely different from what is corruption in Nigeria, and then you can forget everything that has to do with measurement or comparisons. Secondly, it may very well be that dominant theories in this field, there are two dominant theories. One is that this is an ethical problem. The other one that this is what economists call an principal agent problem. That these two theoretical approaches represent serious misspecification of the nature of the problem. So this would be my two arguments here. The reason that we have not been able, or policy agencies all over the world have not been able to do anything seriously about this problem, is that it has been ill-defined and based on wrong type of theories. All the countries you show that have improved, it's very difficult to come up with one explanation for this. For example, you have the small islands thing, you know. Maybe there is something good about being a small island. You create some kind of social unity. Cape Verde, St. Kitts, I mean, us against them, maybe that's good. It seems also, there is also an additional problem here. One finding seems to be, from historical cases, that it's very good to lose wars. If you lose a war, that will create national unity. We have to get our act together. But that is, of course, a hopeless policy recommendation. We cannot go to the war and say, yes, start a number of war and make sure you really lose them, because that will create the type of social unity you need to overcome this problem. So this is a very tricky business. We have to be quite patient when we, before we can come up with any type of policy advice that is based on serious research. Thank you.
Thank you both. Professor Offe, who is one of the earliest inspirers of what we do here.
Well, I was going to start to say, for the last 10 years, I have not really followed up the literature. And 10 years ago, I have written about it and taught a graduate seminar on corruption. And I have occasionally struggled with the conceptual issues more recently, but I have not kept close. I was fascinated by some of the data, and of course, you want, if you have theoretical inclinations that I freely admit to having, then you want to understand what is it in the individual case that makes for such improvements. I mean, Estonia and Protestantism is something that comes up. Size of country may be very important. But let me address some of the, well, one thing before I do that. I was fascinated by the island variable, being a small island. But I strongly disagree with the idea, Bo, that you just suggested, namely that small islands, or islands in general, tend to be homogeneous. They are very often divided. I mean, starting from Cyprus and starting from the British Isles. You have many examples where even the smallest of all, Rapa Nui, has a strong history of ethnic division, right, among 9,000 inhabitants at the maximum. Anyway, so island is a underexplored variable here. But coming back to the main question, public resources for private gain as the umbrella definition, isn't that missing something? Namely, the reverse process. Private resources invested in the shaping of public policy in ways that are not officially provided for. Is that part of, I mean, shaping legislation through lobbyism, or through political finance. Is that buying decisions? For me, my starting definition was always the purchasing of decisions. That corruption is the purchasing of decisions. And you can do that. There's this nice volume by Transparency International that has a collection of caricatures from Moldova on corruption in that country. Do you know that? It's a nice volume of caricatures. They did a contest for cartoons, and how do you feel? One cartoon says, showing parents whose son just graduated from high school. How do you feel after your son has graduated from high school? And the answer of the father is much poorer. Okay, so purchasing decisions, right? High school graduation, that is one version. But purchasing decisions has also the other dimension, namely of paying the campaign contribution for a senator who endorses a certain legislation. So also, is that corruption after Citizens United in the US, but also in other parts of the world? Is that the same, or does it belong in a different bag? Question mark. I would really like to focus discussion on this. At any rate, by corruption we mean the distortion or deviation of public policy or public policy outcomes from an intended or normal or justified or legitimate course, right? So corruption is a distortion or a deviation of policies. And if you want to fight it, and this is the only second point I have to add here at this point, I come back later, if you want to fight it, if you want to return policy and policy outcomes to the intended course or the legal course or the democratical legitimate course, what can you do in order to do so? And I mean, the two obvious kinds of strategies are you do something at the supply side, namely those who make the decisions, and teach them proper behavior, right? You can do that through training of officials and professionals and other holders of public authority, right? You can train them, you can supervise them, you control them, you can punish them, you can remove them from office, provided that you have a sufficient number of replacements available, right? Which is not okay. This is one approach to do so and to get hold of the problem. I would be very interested to see how individual countries, in particular Rwanda, has managed to do that, so that would explain the success. Okay, the other major strategy is, of course, to look at the demand side and shape public attitudes. You simply do not pay your doctor for preferential treatment. This is something that is immoral rather than practical, right? It's immoral because then the doctor engages in unfair practices of treating patients. You do not deserve preferential treatment from a doctor, from a teacher, from a policeman, and so on, just because you pay him. This is, can that be an approach? Norm-building processes, media reporting, attitude building, attitude campaigns, and so on. So that would dry up, as it were, the market for corrupt interactions, right? And what do these countries do that make progress or fail to make progress? in terms of either of these two strategies. So to sum up, basically I would be interested in two distinctions. One is public resources for private gain versus private resources for private gain through public decision making, right? There is a nice conceptual set of proposals. Robert Reich and in particular Larry Lessig have written about institutional corruption, including corruption in the production of publicly policy-wise relevant knowledge. You know, how much sugar in your diet is normal? If you have a normal standardization, official standardization of normal diets, right? How much sugar may go into that? There was a strong fight over decades in the US about raising up the sugar rate to 25%. You know, if your diet consists 25, this is still normal, right? The sugar industry, right? Okay, this is one distinction, and the other is the distinction between supply and demand side in remedial strategies, remedies for this. Let me end by making these two, suggesting these two distinctions for further discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Claus. I'd like to invite Professor Heywood, who's actually one of whose earliest work on political corruption also inspired us quite a while ago. He was among the pioneers in this field.
Thank you very much, and thank you for the invitation to be here. It's a great pleasure to be here. I must just follow up the comment on sugar consumption. There was a beautiful paper recently looking at the correlation between chocolate consumption and Nobel Prizes. And it is extremely strong with one outlier, which is Sweden. So go figure. I think the thing that I would the thing I would start by saying is that the information we've been shown is very impressive in the range that it covers, but sadly it's very unsurprising as well. And it matches almost exactly. I did a study of the Transparency Corruption Perceptions Index and took the 91 countries that appear both in the 2001 index and the 2011 index. There are only 91 countries that are in both of those indices, and ran a regression of one against the other using the 2011 values as the dependent variable, the 2001 values as the independent variable. The 2001 scores explain more than 90% of the variance of the 2011 scores. And if you plot the regression line, the y equals x line, and a non-smooth parametric line on top of each other, they are almost identical. And I guess that just confirms what we know. And it's a depressing story that not much has changed. And not much has changed in spite of all the efforts that have been made over the last 15 to 20 years to make things change. So why is that? That's the question we've been challenged with. The information prompts a whole host of thoughts and reflections, and in the interests of allowing people to be able to contribute to the discussion, I'll keep this fairly short. I'm just going to mention three things. I think one of the reasons that things have maybe not changed, and this picks up a little bit, I think, on some of the things that Bo was saying, I think conceptually we still haven't properly understood what it is that we're trying to fight against. I think the way we specify corruption is a real problem. And we tend to treat it still as a single dimension concept. If it's not a single dimension concept, that's a real problem for us, because it means we're fighting the wrong thing, or we're trying to fight one thing when it's more than one thing. And that could be seriously significant if there is not only just a difference in types of corruption, but actually different types of corruption have different causes, different pathologies, require different responses, then treating corruption as one thing is almost bound to fail. And that therefore matters because we would need different ways to combat, say, state capture on the one hand and petty malfeasance on the other. And I think that is one of the key problems that we've had in terms of fighting corruption. The second key problem, I think, and it links to that to some extent, is that we still have, and in the presentation we've had, this has happened again, we have a tendency to analyze and assess corruption at the nation-state level. We talk of corruption in terms of corruption in country X or corruption in country Y, the amount of corruption here, the amount of corruption there. But corruption, of course, doesn't respect national boundaries. It doesn't reach a state boundary and decide, well, I'm going to stop down, I'm going to become something different in this country that's bordering me. Corruption varies both within countries very significantly, and I think we need to understand that much better. It also goes across countries, and one of the things that we need to understand much better is the links between corruption and transnational networks and the increasing importance of transnational networks in supporting and allowing corruption to take place. And I think there's also a link there between some of the work that Bo was referring to earlier in regard to crime, the work on crime, and maybe that's not so encouraging because we haven't solved that either. But in regard to corruption, of course, a lot of corruption is able to take place precisely because of transnational networks. And when you look at some of the really bad corrupt countries, the countries that you could almost call kleptocracies, where you have leaders, particularly in some of the poorest states, and particularly African states, how are they able to steal the money that they steal? Well, they don't do it solely in their own country. They do it through international networks, which unfortunately involves a lot of countries in the so-called developed West, which enable them to steal that money and relocate it in ways that they can benefit from. The third thing, I think, and that follows on from that point, is that we need to move away from a definitional propensity to see corruption as involving primarily holders of public office rather than operating within the private sector. And what I've just been talking about is only enabled, that kind of kleptocratic stealing of funds is only enabled by private sector actors, particularly in the financial world, allowing those kinds of corrupt activities to take place. And I think there's been an increasing blurring of the distinction between public and private sectors in terms of a whole range of things, provision of public services, but also the notion that a clear distinction now exists between the state on the one hand and public provision, and non-state and private provision and private interests is ever more difficult to sustain. But our understanding of how we analyze and interpret and even define corruption doesn't reflect that increasing blurring between private and public. And I think until we address some of those issues, it's going to be very difficult for us to find the right remedies to combat corruption. I'll leave it there.
Thank you, thank you, thank you. It's now the turn of our colleagues from Transparency International, and Dieter in particular is an interesting character because he runs with NTI. He'll tell you more about this, but he runs something which is like some sort of lab where new ideas are tested. So in fact, the whole hope rests on his lab and whatever they're going to produce there, new and innovative to change all this.
Thanks. It's great to be here. It's great to be part of that consortium. I think we as TI, we're very happy to be on board with such a distinguished group of academics in this consortium with that focus on a multidisciplinary approach to understanding and fighting corruption. So that's really great opportunity. I got really scared when I got the questions for that panel. Who wins, who loses, and what should we do? It kind of reminded me of those essentially unanswerable, like philosophical, fundamental questions. What can we know? What should we do? And what can we hope for? So I'm not even trying to go down that route. But I try to come up with a bit of an eclectic laundry list of like who wins. And I came up with three things. One is Juan in Guatemala. The other one is the education sector in Uganda. And the third one is the compliance industry in the US. And I'm going to explain a little bit why I want to highlight those 3 cases that absolutely don't have anything in common, and make the link back to research and to how this could help us make progress on the research side. So the first one is Juan in Guatemala. Juan is living in a small community in Guatemala. He got really angry when he realized that the mayor in this community had hired 10 of his relatives into public office. And he complained. He tried to complain, and he went all the way to the controller general of that district, and he was basically told that this would not be very likely to succeed. But nevertheless, he was insistent. He contacted the TI chapter in Guatemala, and with the help of the chapter, they formulated a more effective complaint. They went through the different levels of administration, and they really managed to actually get 5 of those relatives fired, and really made a difference on that very kind of local level. The mechanism that he used is what we call Advocacy and Legal Advice Center. That's a service that TI is running in about 50 countries around the world. And those advice centers are very, very successful. They've had about 140,000 contacts in about 3 to 4 years of existence. And the idea is to really provide an interface for the public to come with concrete examples, concrete cases, concrete complaints about corruption, and then help make the way through the institutions with that concrete case and kind of instill a hope for change and a hope for positive impact that is possible. Now, the link to research here is that we're seeing this blurring line, like this has reached like a scale, like the N in the contacts we have is so large that this is like developing into a very interesting resource for research. 140,000 contacts, not all are relevant corruption cases, but there's a incredible interest to kind of articulate complaints about corruption, and there are like serious questions about how to scale up those things, how to analyze them, how to prioritize. And I think we are depending very much on the research community to help us go through this data. And there's a database now in place to capture those cases in a more systematic way and really kind of mine this like in different countries around the world and help us understand priorities and main concerns. The second case was the education sector in Uganda, and this is something that came out of a little research project that we did over the last year that we called Positive Outlier Research, where we basically just went into our 6 years of barometer data. That's a household survey that we do in 50+ countries around the world. It's representative. It's more than 1,000 households per country. That gives a very detailed account of the experience as well as the perception of corruption. So not only perception, but really the experience. People have contact with different service providers. So we basically just went back into this data stock and we tried to find not the drudgery of the trend line, what are the kind of the worst performers or what's kind of the trend in that field, but like really just try to find the positive outliers, the islands in that data set. Sectors, institutions that somehow do surprisingly well compared to the corruption around them in the country or compared to how that sector would do in other countries. And we came up with about 15 cases in that data set, and one is the education sector in Uganda. Now, we don't know what's going on there, but like this is a first lead into doing research and really trying to figure out like how can you make a difference when making a difference seems to be like a very far-fetched proposition. In the third case, the compliance industry in the US, I think it's interesting. I try to find figures. People are throwing around figures of like a 1 billion spent on compliance. I'm not sure how accurate this is. This is news clippings. But huge amounts of money are going into the compliance industry, like a professionalized service to help companies abide by laws. Now, this alone, I think, is a marker that shows that companies are starting to take this serious, take corruption serious from a risk management perspective. And we're seeing like a professionalized service industry coming up around this. And I think it's interesting in the context of how interrelated those systems are. So we're creating like a kind of self-reinforcing mechanism where like a service industry is also interested in communicating the significance of corruption cases to companies. it's not just NGOs anymore making those points. It's a very professionalized service, interested service industry that is kind of getting involved in this. And we see kind of a system of integrity that comes with players that take an interest in integrity, like a self-interest in that case. And I think like seeing corruption from this paradigm of collective action, I think it's on different levels. It's very interesting to try to find the social entrepreneurs, to find the champions of integrity that can benefit, nevertheless, even in a collective action problem situation, from integrity, and then support with collective action tools or with platforms those players, and then make a difference from that point. And finally, maybe it's just like a reflection on like where TI, and I'm not really speaking for TI here, but like where we kind of sense like where our own research and diagnostic work is going to, like echoing some of the things that have been said. So one is like we're really trying to focus more on what works, what doesn't, from different angles, and the lab is trying to do some experiments around this in the future. The second is we also really want to go down from the country level and look at specific sectors, specific community situations, and really look more at the micro, meso level at what is actually going on, what are the dynamics, and how can we make change. I think it starts a lot earlier that certain policy avenues become alternative-less, because at the ideational space there is so much focus on certain ideas, and certain things become unimaginable or are not even kind of discussed in the public discourse. So there's and then it filters down to that level where then there's maybe a convergence between interests of business and politics, because I was at the Sociological Association meeting in the US recently, and I was incredibly stunned to see that talking about the US as a plutocracy or oligarchy seems to be a fairly uncontested objective description, rather than like a very kind of charged claim to make. So that confluence of interest between business and politics, that nexus, is a very interesting one. And I think policy capture also filters down to the enforcement level. And I think this is where we can also, on the indicator side, try to make a bit of a focus on this, to see like what is really the level of enforcement on certain policies, like on white-collar crime and so on. So I think that's kind of like policy capture as a kind of the elephant in the room is a very important topic.
Thank you, Rita. Well, I see a little bit of contradiction of this now presently, to say honestly, because on one hand, it seems that there is, a crave of saying that we need some general theory to explain, right? And on the other hand, there is a drive towards cutting this problem into smaller pieces and on the subnational level and into sectors and going down to the community level. Then I do not think we can have it both ways. I mean, either we would agree that we can have a general theory, and this would be something like North, Weingast, and Wallace, right? Or something on the lines of what I work, because I don't feel the need of a general theory. I think that this universalist versus particularism explains fairly well really everything, because the United States would never be on top of the world in that. And this is why we like United States, because United States has not really made it to the top, but wherever it arrived democratically. So compared to all the other historical achievers that we have, compared to Denmark, for instance, that we documented in our NORAD report, Denmark is not an accessible model, right? Nobody can return in time to have an enlightened monarch who loses a war, who needs to, by competing with his aristocracy, who needs a strong central apparatus, and then to rule them out comes out with a rule which basically says you can have a position only if you have a degree from University of Copenhagen, which of course if you are a count or a marquis or a prince is not something that you would consider doing. So this kind of things you just cannot do, so you cannot return 150 years back to certain of these paths. But the situation of most of our countries today is very much like United States after the Civil War. So in other words, you have elections, you have strongmen, you have a lot of private security. The government really fights to get the monopoly of violence, and it doesn't get it yet. All right, you have to hire Pinkerton for rule of law in some Western states, because otherwise you cannot solve it. The sheriff is appointed by the strongmen and the rest, and this is the situation that we have. And I think that this situation actually is something that we could try studying and reproducing, while Denmark is definitely out of reach. Okay, the difference is, and this is what puzzles me, and this is what I'm working on, and I'm a bit scared about this. The difference is that I'm afraid that United States, and this came out in our discussion with Ted Ascoch-Pollitt at Harvard this year, when he said, "Oh, that's a good example, you know, follow United States. That's a good idea. Stand on it." I said, yes. But the thing is, however, that United States, when Tocqueville visited them, already had more associations and collective action than my country has today. Okay. So this democratic path, yes, I think that obviously the challenges are similar, but it's simply pushing the problem in another area where it's not more easy to solve. Okay, and so thank you for this very valuable insights. And to move to indicators, let me just give a little bit of example about, again, Dieter's Guatemalan example, which was very nice. I mean, I envy this person, Juan, or whatever his name is, because, for instance, I'm not among the anti-corruption winners. I was considered an anti-corruption winner in quite important situation. I have such international press files about anti-corruption campaigns with very clear indicators that I've won, all right? So I made 100 MPs lose office. The problem is that 100 MPs who were non-corrupt, who took their place, were equally corrupt 4 years later. Okay, so it very much depends where the standpoint is to appreciate if we are if we really succeed. All right, I thought I made it quite a number of times, but in fact, my impression is that I didn't make it. And, there are some indicators. 10 years ago, it was the government, the ministers, the heads of secret services, whose wealth we disclosed and other things, who are suing us. Now it's us who are suing them. If you look at this, you would say that there is some progress, right? Now it's us who sue them, and they are forced to make public contracts, like the contract with Ford in Romania, which was a secret privatization contract. I sued them, I won, and this made. But in the exact cases as Juan, for instance, I didn't manage, and I'm in the European Union. I'll just give this example. There is something nice in my country, in many former communist countries, which is called a state protocol agency, which basically has all the dachas and villas from communist time, and even palaces, all right, which used to belong to royalty, and then they were nationalized and belonged to the people. And whoever is in government is enjoying this nice, luxurious villas and the rest. All right, and we have been trying to sue this agency. We have been trying to kill it. We have been trying to close it through many governments that we managed to change, and we were even apart at some point. But this ever survives. So last January, the government falls on an issue related to this protocol thing, and I say to myself, okay, now it is the moment. And immediately we push against the head of this agency, who has been, even stealing selling some of these things, insidiously doing everything. And what does he do? He switches from the former government party to the current government party. And he keeps his position, of course, because everyone needs these villas. Everyone needs someone that you need to call. I mean, why change the poor guy when he already does this business so well, all right? So yes, I am envious, and I think I will keep for the next 20 years doing what I've done for the past 20, but I'm just, less optimistic than I was that you can stop at some point and say, really, I made it, I made a big difference. And this is why I started to develop this sector indicators, because we simply need to understand what goes on. And I'm very sensitive to all the criticisms to these indicators. We just need something to look at. Plus, I also believe that, that most policy arena is national. So you have to keep the national field. This is, in many ways, a framework that has to stay, even if you should go deeper and deeper. All right, and we try to go deeper and deeper with indicators, but I'll tell you from my experience with the commission this year, and some of the students who worked with me are probably here, this is very difficult, because the kind of data that I collected in Romania, for instance, because I know the country well, or that some of my students are collecting in Brazil or in other countries, it's very difficult to collect in EU 27 countries when you go around. I mean, these days I'm in a review board at OLAF, the European Anti-Fraud Agency. There is absolutely no unified data on procurement. OLAF is the first who's not really very generous and transparent with its data, however, spends millions to hire researchers to analyze it. When there are researchers tell, but give it to me. And they say, well, but I don't have it. I mean, if we were able to have it, we don't need you. So in fact, what they do is that, what researchers do is that they start interviewing OLAF. And they say, where do you think some more significant data of yours should be found for us to analyze? And it's very difficult to come up with indicators which are time sensitive, which are change sensitive, which are policy sensitive. And on top of this, I heard someone from the European Commission after struggling for months. And they said, you know, but at the minimal, they told me they have to be all this. Okay, I have to be all this. They don't entirely understand what this means, many of them. But they should also be comparative EU27, right? So what do you mean they should also be comparative EU27? I mean, I won't find any data in Sweden about highways not being built with EU money because there's no money on EU money in infrastructure in Sweden. So rather difficult. How do we answer to this challenge? I'm not going to do roundtable, you know, symmetrically this time. Again, I'm just inviting whoever has any idea about the second generation of indicators and how would Anticorp take up this challenge.
First, a comment on the conceptual thing. I think there is a risk of broadening the concept of what is corruption. And I'm thinking of when I was a young PhD student, the big thing was planning. Everyone was studying planning until a famous American scholar Aaron Wildavsky wrote an article, if everything is planning, maybe it's nothing. We have to be able to distinguish corruption from bad policies. There are a number of policies we don't like, but that need not be corruption. We have to be able to distinguish it from standard type of lobbying. There are many types of lobbying I don't like, but it's not corruption. In ethnographic work, many people have said, well, if you go to do ethnographic work in third world countries, you would see that people give gifts. And so it's bribes. Well, it's really not, because the gifts are public. Everyone knows what is an acceptable gift. And if you triple, that's not acceptable. So I think it's important sort of to keep it, not let it float out enormously, because then we will end up in the Wildavsky problem. Everything we dislike is corruption, and then you can forget anything about measurements. Secondly, one thing that has surprised me in this research is that when you read the ethnograph, my reading of the ethnographic work, my reading of the Afrobarometer, my reading of Transparency International corruption barometer, is that it comes with some quite surprising news. People in heavily corrupt settings do not have another moral vision or understanding of corruption than people in our part of the world. They perfectly understand that it's morally wrong. They perfectly understand that it is hurting their societies. We sent our students as field assistants to African countries, asking them to interview mid-level people, principals of schools, healthcare facilities, not the elite, and they came back with this result. But two of them were very smart, so they started to ask people, if people have this opinion that corruption is really a morally bad thing, and that corruption is hurting their country, why don't you see more political protest? Why are not people out on the street? And then came a very surprising answer from many of the people we interviewed. It's not our money. They hardly pay any taxes. So what the political elite is doing with aid money or plundering natural resources, but it's not our money. And then, of course, we have a long list of leading economists, from Gary Becker to Alberto Alesina and Nobel laureates, who sort of put their name behind the following, that the boot out corruption, root out big government. The problem is big government. Actually, the data is the opposite. It's countries where people pay lots of taxes that have low corruption. So it's the other way around. So I think this is an interesting finding in its own. I mean, this is ethnographic work. We don't have massive data, but this is my interpretation of it. Secondly, I think we should connect, if I were a policy activist, I'm not, I'm a researcher, I would connect anti-corruption to human rights. Not being forced to pay bribes for a service, not being discriminated because you belong to a minority in public services. I think that's part of the human rights. And if you read the work of human rights, there is in the recent issue of New York Review of Books a fantastic article by Ignatieff on the success of the human rights. Three things comes out. First, they have been phenomenally successful. Secondly, they were successful because they didn't expand the concept deliberately. And third, what seemed to work, and this is a surprise, I think, was actually naming and shaming. That seems to have worked. So one thing we should try to do is to think more about corruption in the human rights perspective, if you want things that maybe could work. Because think about it, human rights, nobody took it seriously until the 1970s, and today it's a big thing. And it actually, I mean, had an impact, if I understand how it's not the only case why the former Soviet empire fell, but it was one important reason that they could.
Bad PR.
Yeah, actually. Thanks.
Oh, please come in.
I'll just pick up on that. I mean, I think the point you make, Bo, about the need to avoid allowing corruption to become so extended that it's just everything that we don't like is extremely well made and incredibly important. But unfortunately, I think we have seen over the last 10 to 15 years precisely that happen. So the discourse around corruption, particularly in some regions of the world, has been allowed to be captured as it's just, you know, almost the element of last resort which explains anything that doesn't work. And that is particularly difficult when you then want to combat it, because everything is corruption, and the discourse around corruption makes trying to untangle what it is that you're actually trying to combat extremely difficult. The other dimension to it, of course, is that corruption is a term that's freighted with negativity. It's a bad thing. It's about the only thing that we do agree on in regard to corruption is that it's a bad thing. We don't agree on its causes, we don't agree on its definition, we don't agree on how you measure it, etc. But you will get more or less universal agreement on the negative impact of corruption. So people don't like corruption, they don't like talking about corruption. I'm struck by comments made by Leslie Holmes, who works in Australia at a workshop that Davida and I were at earlier this year. He does a lot of work training the police in Australia around corruption. And he used to start out with these courses for police officers in Australia about the risks of corruption, the dangers of corruption, what you have to do to avoid corruption. And they went terribly, and the police really wouldn't engage, and they were very, very negative about these courses. Then he switched the course to talking about integrity, and he gave exactly the same course, but instead of talking about corruption, he spoke about integrity, the importance of integrity, how you make sure that integrity is at the heart, and the response was completely different, and the police clearly thought, yeah, of course, you know, we're all about integrity, we can buy that. And the discourse there, I think, is quite significant in regard to what we're doing. And I do think we have to pay some attention to what it is that we are talking about and how we go about talking about it when it comes to trying to combat corruption.
Klaus, Dieter?
Yeah. Several points. I understand the need to limit the range of what is covered by a concept like corruption. I mean, at the empirical level, Bo, I would like to see data of the following sort. You say people understand, agree, not just researchers believe that corruption is wrong, but people do believe that it is wrong. It should not be. We should have a model of the proper conduct of public office. right? And this is violated. However, you get a collective action problem here. Even people who share the moral view that this is wrong also have to face the situation that everyone else is doing it. And therefore, unfortunately, I have to do it myself, both on the demand side and on the supply side. So, I mean, the moral judgment is not operational in that sense, because a situation is given where, I mean, in the individual case, it works as a lever of making your life successful, or making your son graduate from high school, right? You have to do it because everyone else is doing it. This is considered to be normal. So
hence the importance of the national context again, right?
Yeah, okay. And then the question is how far you can get through attitude campaigns and moral suasion and strengthen the norms and so on, or what else? I mean, maybe paying your teachers and policemen better than you have done so far makes it more affordable to resist a wrong pattern of behavior, right? Makes it more affordable because they have their safe income rather than have to depend upon the returns from it. But I would, this is my second point, still insist on the importance of looking in both directions. Public office or public resources available for private gain and benefit, including cases of nepotism, where you use your decision-making power as a mayor to hire all these relatives of yours, right? This is one version. But the other version is equally known to be dishonest, purchasing decisions of the senators or of other kinds of lawmakers or government officials, so that they do not pay you, but the group you speak for. And it's not your private pockets, but the normal course of competition. I mean, industries compete with internal and external other suppliers of the same goods, and it can be of great help in that situation and worth major investments if you get your senator to support a protective tariff or protective rule or a deal. Also, it may help a great deal, and this is what Lessig and others mean by institutional corruption. It helps a great deal to keep items and issues off the agenda. I mean, what in the all the literature is called non-decision making. You know, don't make it an issue. Wonderful book by Cranston of the 70s on the non-politics of air pollution, right? Keep it off the agenda. Deny climate change for 20 years, right? Avoid it to become something that is even looked at. The same with my sugar example, right? Tobacco industry, and so on, and so on. Isn't that a case of corruption? The purchase of the illegitimate purchase of decisions. And shouldn't that be included? Last remark. I think it was a very good idea of the project to include state building into the agenda, right? And I mean, state building, monopoly of power, rule of law, division of powers, sovereignty, rather than being the agenda of the state being controlled by partial interests, as they call it. But there are degrees. of state building, the degrees of stateness. And I want to suggest that indicators that have become very popular over the last 10 years of state capacity, both extractive capacity, taxing your economy, and of executing state decisions should enter into the picture. There are degrees of stateness. It's not just a state, a proper state versus a failed state. There are degrees, as we presently see in the EU context. There are a degree of state capacity, and there are good measures of such as some of the one I suggested, taxing capacity. I mean, this should converge with your interests in other contexts very much. So degrees of state capacity could be correlated to the evidence of the presence of corruption in both directions. Incidentally, last point, there is a slightly cynical but empirically remarkably valid, I think, you know, it's impressionistic evidence distinction that is made by a German conservative constitutional lawyer by the name of Isensee, who said in a newspaper article 10 years ago or so, there are two kinds of corruption. One is corruption where public money go into private pockets, and it is typically left-wing corruption. Whereas right-wing corruption is where private money goes into public decision-making, right? And it is remarkably valid on prima vista evidence in various cases I've seen.
Okay, thank you. Bo, you have a follow-up, but short, please. We are approaching the end of this.
Yeah, short. Politics is an interest-based thing. And you will always have money floating into the system. It's not so easy to say where the legitimate is different from the illegitimate. You have unions supporting left-wing parties to get more labor laws and so on. However, I like very much Paul's idea about integrity. And I think, but in a democratic system, it will not work if there are not some instances who are not part of this interest struggle. Think about free and fair elections in a new democracy. If the people who manage and count the votes don't have integrity, they will, and are, in my words, impartial, nobody will accept the outcome. Now, as a Swede today in Germany, it feels right to make a reference to soccer. So, how many of you have been to a soccer game? I guess many have been. Now I have a question for you who have been to a soccer game or a hockey game. How many of you are cheering for the referees? How many are supporting the referees? Say, yes, that was a good decision. Usually not. And this is the problem, that people who do not participate, who are not sort of paid to be on one or the other side, this is a little rare thing, you know. Everyone knows that in a soccer league, if you cannot have impartial judges, the league will collapse. Nobody will play. But there are actually very few agents who stand up for the refugees, right? And this is the problem we face. Politics is an interest-based struggle. Everyone wants decisions that favors them, right? However, everyone knows that if there are not some people who are at least shielded from this interest struggle, it will go astray.
Which is why your point about impartiality and Alina's about universalism is so important.
Thank you. I didn't want to say that myself.
Okay, Dieter, any final thoughts?
Yeah, maybe just this point on the definition. I think it's maybe a little bit like with this US Supreme Court judge who once said, I cannot define pornography, but I know it when I see it. And maybe We shouldn't shy away from like conceptually kind of more hazy issues like policy capture, because we might not be able to define every case in a kind of very definitive way. But I think if things are completely out of balance, and of course we're not approaching this with a naive kind of conception of interest politics, but if things are clearly out of sync, out of balance, in terms of who gets the attention and gets the ear of decision makers, or I think then we can work with the institutional system around that and see what we can do better in that context.
Claus, please.
I want to give this debate, that we could continue for hours, a slight. No, we will not. No, we could. Okay? Counterfactual. A slightly institutionalist twist. Everything you say is very right, and if I may say so, not new. Politics is interests, right? But
Marxist.
But the institutional system that regulates the resources of political parties and the status of interest groups and the publicity of special interests in politics may be very different. There are rules. They are not just interests, there are rules. And some rules create opportunity structures, and some foreclose opportunities for corruption of the second sort. And countries differ by that, and that may correlate with their degree of stateness or state capacity. Thanks.
Okay. Yeah. Okay, thank you. Just a word on top of this definition problems that we have. Last year when we published this NORAD report, we have become a bit unpopular among people who really work on promoting United Nations Convention Against Corruption, simply because we published very elementary evidence that countries which adopted this have not progressed statistically more than countries which did not. Okay, but that is simply because I think that someone has to be very naive to expect that this is how importance of UNCAC would show through a finding like this. In fact, I think that the importance of UNCAC is elsewhere, is in the fact that it does give a clear definition of corruption, that by now 100-something, quite a lot of countries have ratified this, that this definition basically says that any discretionary allocation of money and non-universal of public resources is corrupt. And I see that this is more and more, actually being adopted by policymakers. So I think that it is an end to cultural and actually to institutional relativism in many, many ways. At Olaf a few days ago, I was looking at this. I cannot produce this on EU27, but I can produce it on 3-4 countries to show that, in fact, EU funds are distributed across political party lines. This is not illegal in any way. So some people could say, but that's not corrupt at all, that, that when liberals are in government, their liberal-affiliated companies take all EU money, and then when conservatives are in government, it happens the same. Well, but actually there are companies which are neither liberal nor conservative who systematically are unable to access this kind of money, and this is what makes this corrupt. And I didn't make this argument. I just said, is this statistical non-randomness that I present in any way interesting for an investigation? And they said, yes, this is corruption. We are now accepting this. We would not have accepted it a few years ago, but we're now accepting it, and we would start an investigation if something like this would produce. But of course, you realize how difficult it is to come up with indicators like this, and how much work is simply to trace these companies, their shareholders, and of course, these companies will also learn. Now we find them because their shareholders, we find their political ties. But in a few years, as probably my colleagues from Eastern Europe or from Italy can tell you, this kind of ties may actually disappear, and they will find more insidious way of moving it further, but the connection, this invisible connection, will still exist somewhere, or maybe not. So maybe by developing better indicators and by forcing these people into hiding, they will lose themselves. That is my hope. And with this, we have to end because cocktail is waiting, and our bus for Potsdam leaves in less than an hour. Thanks, everyone, and especially our very distinguished panel.